Hello everyone, I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One-on-One. This week we're going to be using our podcast to talk about another podcast project. But first, a little bit of background. North Carolina's Community Foundation and the North Carolina Local News Lab Fund recently announced more than $300,000 worth of grants. The money is going to organizations and initiatives that will provide news and information related to hurricane recovery and preparing for future storms. One of the organizations receiving the grant funding is called Working Narratives, a nonprofit group out of Wilmington. Working Narratives has already produced one podcast project. Moving forward with this grant funding, they're going to produce another series of podcasts specifically designed to tell the stories of those devastated by the hurricanes and what can be done to help some of these communities. My guest for this week's conversation is the Communications Director for Working Narratives, Rend Smith. Rend, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about what got you and your organization involved in trying to use a podcast for this project.
So we're essentially an organization of storytellers. My background is as a journalist. I've loved stories for as long as I can remember. And we've discovered that stories are not just entertaining, they're a great organizing principle. So one of the ways that you can bring folks together and get them to support things like policy change is to have a story circle where people share their experiences, their knowledge, and that allows them to build connections that help them build networks, that build communities, that build power, right?
So it's dominoes right on top of each other.
Right, exactly.
And how are you using Fair Bluff as kind of like the centerpiece for this whole project? Or it was kind of a spark, wasn't it?
Sure. I mean, Fair Bluff is a place that has personally fascinated me. You have an African-American community there that's been there for a long time, is a substantial African-American community, but is often separated by geography and race as far as the national conversation. And so what we found with these historically ignored communities is that although they have lots to say and although they have extreme information needs, they tend to be an information poverty center. So there's not information coming out and there's not much information coming in. One of the ways that you can change that dynamic is to bring people together, to amplify each other's stories, to tell one another's stories, to connect over those stories, and to organize around those stories.
Now tell me, I know the Community Foundation and NC News Lab Fund grant that you got was for the podcast and also for holding roughly a dozen events in New Hanover, Columbus, Pender County, and Brunswick County.
Yes.
But where did the inspiration come to put the podcast, and what are you hoping to use the podcast for?
Right, yeah, so that's my fault. You know, like a lot of African Americans, the roots of my family are in the South. There are, of course, so many communities here that are African American and that are virtually invisible. So we have been for, I think, the last year or so, you'll forgive me if I can't get the timeline exactly right, been working on a podcast series called Storm Stories, which generally help us tell the narrative of what's been happening in places like Wilmington post-Florence. So, you know, for instance, the number one issue really at this point is housing.
Right.
It's people losing their homes, it's people trying to find homes, it's people living in homes that are somewhat dangerous, mold infested, damaged, and certainly not livable, right? And we've dug into that a little bit. We've dug into what's happening for folks in a very general way and talked to people from diverse communities. The idea with Flood Zone, which is a follow-up to the podcast series that we're now at the very end of completion on,
Nearing the end.
We're nearing the end of.
And Flood Zones is going to be what this new project is for the grant is funding, correct?
Right. It's more concentrated. It's more focused. It's particularly for African American communities because we see a special need there. We see that, again, traditionally, these places occupy zones of silence. Right.
And which neighborhoods really don't have a voice many times, and that's what you want to try to do is give them their voice through the podcast.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a very interesting relationship between story and empathy. I've heard a writer talk about the ability to understand slavery as being strongly linked to, the novel Beloved, because Beloved offers us a story about what it was like to be a slave, what it was like to live day to day as a slave. That's Beloved by Toni Morrison. Mm-hmm. And it puts all of the facts and the timelines in context, and it makes us more human through contact with
gives more people an understanding and giving them the story that otherwise they may not hear.
Right, yeah.
So is this what most people, I believe, listen to podcasts for entertainment, whether it's true crime, whether it's rock and roll stars or whatever the case may be. So this is going to be, tell me if I'm correct here, kind of like a hybrid education, mm-hmm. Empathy, like you said, but also inspiration to try to help people in communities like Fair Bluff?
Yeah, so one of the things we want to highlight is not just, we don't want to just focus on the struggles of folks in places like Fair Bluff, but we want to highlight the resilience that they show. So they've found ways to survive, and often as marginalized communities do, they've found these resistances, ways to keep going each day, and not only keep going, but to celebrate each day. As far as building ourselves as a nation, it's important for us to hear these voices and hear their experiences and learn from them.
Laura Bratton was the host of Storm Stories.
Yes.
And the one episode that I got a chance to hear, she actually did with a former resident of Fair Bluff, Gloria Walters. We're going to listen to a piece of that now, and is this what it's going to be like the next round of it too, similar to what Laura did with the first ones?
Yes, with a specific focus on rural African American communities. Exactly.
Okay, let's listen to Laura's Storm Stories with Gloria Walters.
Welcome to Storm Stories, a collection of stories from Hurricane Florence. This podcast series explores resilience and recovery in the coastal region through local stories. I'm your host, Laura Bratton, broadcasting from the Working Narrative Studio. Today on Storm Stories.
I hate that I lost my home the way I did because I love the Fair Bluff. I've been living there since 1986, and I still go by there and I ride and I look. I get teary-eyed because all that I invested in there, and and it just came and just took it like this within the twinkling of an eye, not once but twice.
No matter how much we learn about hurricanes, they're hard to make sense of in the moment. One minute, everything is normal. The next, there's chaos. People impacted by the disaster will need help, but sometimes it's hard to know exactly what kind. Gloria Walters is a survivor of not one, but two hurricanes, Matthew and Florence. These storms took everything: her town, her community, her house, her clothes. Today, I find myself wanting to know more about Gloria, what she lived through, and what keeps her going. Originally from South Carolina, Gloria moved to Fair Bluff, North Carolina in the 80s. Fair Bluff is where she raised her children, and later, where they raised their children.
Fair Bluff was a little town. If you ride through and blink your eyes, you'll miss it. It's just a little small community, you know everybody.
Fair Bluff is a rural, majority black town in Columbus County where 21% of residents live below the poverty line. Like many rural communities, it's fighting chronic unemployment, shrinking populations, and reduced government services. It doesn't help that in Fair Bluff, floods have become the new normal. For Gloria, Fair Bluff is home, or at least it was until Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016. Type Fair Bluff into Google, and you'll see articles that tell the story of how Matthew threatened to turn Fair Bluff into a ghost town.
Hurricane Matthew affected me in ways that it's hard to even explain. It was 1 minute I was there, then the next minute I was gone. My house is 4 feet up, and I had 3 feet of water in the house. I cried at least I know for about 3 months straight.
Anybody who watched Matthew coverage on TV saw the images. Houses and roads submerged in stagnant water. Gloria is one of 111 residents whose homes were flooded out as a result of the estimated 19 inches of rain and over 12 feet of floodwaters. With her house in shambles and most of her things destroyed, Gloria, her husband, and her grandson stayed in a hotel provided by FEMA for 4 months.
Didn't have nowhere to go. I didn't have no clothes, no nothing. No bed. I wore one dress. I know I wore that one dress for a month. It was me, my husband, my grandson at the beach under FEMA for 4 months.
And how did you feel while all of this was going on?
I started feeling like nobody didn't care about us, not even my own family. You about to make me get emotional. It's been a while since I cried about this. But I felt like nobody didn't care.
Imagine if half your town was suddenly displaced. After Matthew, this happened to Fair Bluff. Its population was reduced by more than half of what it was before the storm. The few hundred that remain in Fair Bluff are still living in poor conditions as a result of Matthew. Many expressed frustration that FEMA didn't do enough.
People there are still affected. Some people there are still living with no lights. Some just don't want to leave. Some say they don't have nowhere to go. Some people are still living there with mold in their house. What we're doing on our own.
And how are they feeling through all of this?
Some I talked to, oh my God, they're just so upset. To me, it's still kind of sad because I feel like I left them. Even when I go back to visit my daughter, it's like I be a rush to get out of that town. And I tell my daughter all the time, you need to try to get out of it. But I do feel sad for my friends, and I pray for them. It's really sad because they don't have nowhere to go. They saying that they can't afford to leave, but it's just a relief that I am.
After Hurricane Matthew, Gloria and her husband moved to Whiteville, North Carolina, the seat of Columbus County. There, she received support from the school and community members, most notably a woman named Walise Todd. Walise is the founder of Community CPR. It's a nonprofit focused on helping people directly impacted by Matthew.
The Lord did place people in my life, the school, Walise, and a few other people start reaching out to help me. And then I started feeling a relief because, the help was not there. When I met Walise, she come and she was, oh God, she was such a big help.
The move was a big change for Gloria. Whiteville is bigger. It's got a population of over 5,000. It's got more stores, more roads, and more resources. And Gloria says she's liking it so far.
I had to go change my license. I had to do voting. I had to do everything. I had to become a citizen of Whiteville. Other than that, I love Whiteville. Whiteville's a good community, and everything is right here, and it's available for me more now. So, I got more street lights. There's Walmart. Everything around me now, I got more advantage of now. I don't have that far to go now, just a skip and a hop.
Just as Gloria was getting back on her feet in Whiteville, only 2 years after Matthew, Hurricane Florence hit. The storm dumped over 25 inches of rain on the city. Gloria says she was too discouraged to seek help.
When Florence came, we had no help. We had nowhere to go get help. We were still trying to recoup from Matthew. Lost all my stuff in storage, at the mini storage. I just didn't even seek for no help. At that point, I said, Lord, I'm not going to worry about it.
Despite it all, Gloria finds a way to stay connected to her family and friends that are left in Fair Bluff. Once, every week or two, she drives to the local post office, where she still keeps a mailbox.
I didn't want to leave them completely. They'll see me coming through and I'll stop by the store. Oh, you home? No, I just come check my mailbox.
Sometimes the help people need, it turns out, is helping others. Research says people who help others are healthier and tend to be less anxious and depressed. Today, Gloria works as an advocate at Community CPR, helping people with experiences like her own through tough times. She walks with them as they piece together the remains of their personal lives in the aftermath of Hurricane Florence. People like Gloria are helping guide coastal North Carolina through its hurricane recovery, and that's building future resilience.
People will come in here sharing their story. We sit down there, I'm crying with them. I pray with them. I encourage them. I tell them my story, let them know. I let them know if I can do it, you can do it. It's going to be all right. I survive, you're going to survive. You will win because I did it, you can do it. You know, God will allow things to happen just to open your eyes. I had to be bring all the way down to my lowest to see. But now I feel like God has raised me up. I've been restored. I look back over my life to where God has brought me from now. I'm still blessed. I'm still blessed.
You've been listening to Storm Stories. Storm Stories is a project of the nonprofit arts and media organization Working Narratives, which is based in Wilmington, North Carolina.
Okay, once again, that is Storm Stories by Working Narratives. Laura Bratton is the host. That specific episode was with Gloria Walters, a resident of Fair Bluff who moved after Matthew, got hit again in Whiteville by Hurricane Florence. So you talk about somebody who's resilient.
Right.
She lived in Fair Bluff, raised her own children, and then now is actually trying to help people in the same kind of situation that she's in. What did you learn from her story when you heard it?
Yeah, and I'll mention that Gloria is working with a great organization called Community CPR.
Right.
And, you know, she's doing good work. You know, and from someone like Gloria, I think we learn the same thing that we learn from other community members, which is that people find ways to survive, they find ways to have an impact on each other's lives. And, you know, if we can hold up that example of, you know, that extraordinary resilience, maybe folks in other communities will feel heartened, maybe they'll begin to replicate it, and maybe, you know, basically we will improve the living situations of countless people.
Whether they be in Cumberland County along the Lumber River, and Lumberton, Fair Bluff, and other communities like Princeville, up toward Greenville area.
Yes.
So many of these communities.
Extraordinary history. Yeah.
And so if you can help one person, then it's been a benefit.
And it's important for us to start thinking about and talking about climate change displacement. This is going to be particularly impactful in the African American community. There's a lot of history sort of bound up with the coast having at one point offered cheap land. There's a lot of history bound up in African American communities being built in flood zones because that offered cheaper land. So you have a community that's ultimately going to be impacted in an incredible way by rising waters, and that will compound all of the historical oppressions these communities have had to resist as well.
And the flow of information oftentimes does not make it into some of those communities as freely and as quickly as it may in other areas.
Yeah, so the organization, the foundation that's helping to support this work is called the Democracy Fund, and one of the things they focus in on is the fact that media ecologies are extremely important to communities. In terms of civic engagement, in terms of democracy, those things only work when people have the information necessary to make decisions about their communities, and also to join movements that are focused on policy change. None of that can happen without the sharing of stories and information.
And literally making sure that entire communities are set on a better path moving forward, so that in case another storm comes, we don't have a repeat of what has happened in Fair Bluff, with the population after Matthew dwindling to half, and now half again, where there's just a few hundred people living in a community that used to be bustling when tobacco was the big crop, and used to do so many other things with agriculture that literally may not be on the map in the next 5 years.
This is the new normal, right? Like, we have to understand exactly where we are living in terms of the impact of climate change. And, you know, historically, again, the folks most affected by it have been African American, of color, low income white communities, all of the most vulnerable people, because if you have these systems that only function well if they have carte blanche in a specific community and can do all sorts of things environmentally that are harmful, you know, you basically, you can't have a system like that in the backyard of someone who is engaged with their civic structure, who has power in terms of their government.
A voice.
Right, yeah.
Who has a voice.
Right, it can only exist in these pockets of, let's say, disempowerment, right?
Okay, we're talking once again to Rend Smith, who is the communications director and a project director for the nonprofit group Working Narratives. As the communications director, give us a timeline. When might we see some of these first Working Narrative flood zone podcasts, and when are we going to see some of the meetings?
Yeah. So we often have a kind of a slow build. We're a nonprofit. Our focus is social justice and arts. And that means that, you know, we want to take particular care with the way we pick our methodologies.
Okay.
So, and, you know, one of the things we always do is enter into a collaborative design process with the communities that we work with. So that means making sure that we're having a two-way conversation instead of a one-way conversation. Everyone that we work with should want us there, should understand why we're there, and should support what we're doing. And so that means inviting them in an equitable partnership and really talking every aspect of the project out. So yeah, we have a general timeline, like we'd like to, of course, get this done or started. I believe that our first meeting is scheduled for September.
Okay.
That said,
rough time frame.
Yeah. That said, it's all up to the community
and how they respond and members respond. So the meetings that we're talking about in New Hanover, Columbus, Pender, and Brunswick County are meetings of the community, which will then, you hope, as I take it here, set you on a roadmap for actually doing the Flood Zone podcast, then, right?
Yeah. So, there are two components, like one is a media component and one is a community component.
Right.
So there would be a live storytelling event where people get together and share stories in that story circle model that I talked about before. Yeah. And then there would be documentation of those stories and the kind of process that goes into making them into a podcast for folks to, you know, enjoy.
You're talking now in July of 2019. Let's take it out 2 years.
Right,
You're looking back at this project. What do you hope to accomplish? What would you look at and say, we were successful?
Yeah, I think work like this is ultimately has to be successful because, again, we're looking at a new normal. I think we're going to be looking at powerful storms, storms like we've never seen before, and we are going to have to come up with a policy response and a cultural response. Like, we're going to have to figure out how we build resilience in communities, and we're also going to have to figure out how we keep our emotional resilience up through culture. Right? So I think when I look forward, I see storm stories as being storm stories and flood zones.
Right.
These podcasts and these stories as being part of a kind of larger network of folks who, you know, look at our idea, and this has happened for us before, and they replicate it in other places. And, you know, we keep our connections and our relationships with them healthy, and all of a sudden we have like essentially a sea change. Right?
So basically, it's more than just we want to release 8 episodes by December of 2020. You're looking at a more umbrella-like process here rather than a physical product that's out on the market for others to hear.
Right. And I should mention that a big part of what we do is actually media training. So it's not just that we want people to tell their stories and we want to document them and we want to turn them into a podcast. We want them to do all those things. We want to make ourselves irrelevant in that process.
A conduit, almost?
Yeah. So, we're there at the beginning, but we're hoping the community takes over in the end. And that's, again, a part of the replication process because, once we're done in one community, we don't want the work to stop. We want the work to begin somewhere else.
Where can people access the storm stories? Where can they go to listen to those podcasts?
So the best place to access the podcast and information about the podcast is our website, which is www.workingnarratives.org.
Okay.
So Storm Stories, which I believe we have a kind of a trailer up where folks can hear a sample of what we're going to be releasing. And then in the next few days, we'll be releasing, I believe it's 8 to 10 podcasts. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the one that we just heard here is one that will soon be released of all of the stories that have been put together.
Yes, exactly.
And it inspired by a lifelong resident, previously lifelong resident of Fair Bluff. So a community that really took it on the chin in 2016, got hit again, is really the spark for this project in many ways.
Mm-hmm. The New York Times, of course, famously referred to Fair Bluff as a ghost town because it lost almost half of its population after Matthew. And the situation has only grown more severe after Florence. This is a community that was a home for people. And to be unmoored, to have to leave, is essentially to be made a refugee.
And many people don't know what the future holds for Fair Bluff.
Yeah.
The downtown in their that community, no businesses. It used to be a vibrant downtown, pharmacy, doctor's office. Really, the future is a question mark.
Yeah, and I have to say I'm so impressed that you all are interested in this because a lot of the time, these stories, once Anderson Cooper leaves and the headlines fade, people ignore them. They feel like the storm is over and so the suffering is over. But really, the challenges go on for years.
And it's a challenge to us in the media as journalists, reporters, anchors, and storytellers to make sure that these stories are still told years after a Matthew, a year after a Florence. And Fair Bluff is the community that so many people saw the boats going down Main Street, submerged cars. They'd like to see that community vibrant again. To see the American comeback story in many ways, but hasn't been written yet.
Yeah, and historically, this area has like the ultimate example of how hurricanes can change the geographical, political, and social landscape. And that's, in terms of the Seabreeze community.
Yes, right down there along the Intercoastal Waterway.
Right, was here for almost 100 years, was a cultural hub for African Americans, was a business hub for African Americans, and was pretty much wiped off the map by Hurricane Hazel. And then, it stayed that way essentially because of neglect.
Yes, and hit right down there along the Snows Cut bridge down that way, if those of you who are unfamiliar with it. Still a community with many of the historic buildings still standing.
Yeah. But not a marker, really.
Right, and not as vibrant as it used to be.
Right, yeah.
Tremendous history in that Seabreeze community. Rend Smith is the communications director and a project director for Working Narratives. Again, if you'd like to learn more about the organization, workingnarratives.org.
Yes.
Look for the podcast Storm Stories, hosted by Laura Bratton. That should be anywhere that you can get a podcast.
Yes.
All the different podcast apps.
Stitcher and Apple.
including the One-on-One with John Evans podcast that we're talking on right now. And then look for flood zones on down the line and all the work that this organization is going to do, thanks to the North Carolina Community Foundation and local News Lab grants. Rend, we appreciate you coming in.
I appreciate it.
And we wish you well, and a new use for podcast. This has been very entertaining and educational for me, but turning a podcast into a new kind of educational vehicle that you and the organization are doing need to be saluted. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you. And I hope we get to check in later as well.
Before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please subscribe to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast and leave us a rating or a review if you would be so kind. The more reviews and ratings we get from listeners like you, the higher we'll be listed on all of the major podcast sites. I'm John Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode of One-on-One.